Imagine the template of the 20th century dictator. There is a coup d'etat or a civil war to reach power. There are massive purges to preserve it. There is a cult of personality, bank accounts in Switzerland, palaces with everything gold-plated, and an escape plan for the day everything collapses. Hitler appears automatically on that list. He is the dictator, the archetype, the name that defines the entire category, but there is something that almost no one notices. In practically every axis that historians use to measure dictatorships, Hitler not only broke that template, he was its exact opposite. He was handed power legally. He never purged his inner circle. He did not name a successor until the final hours of his life. He built no dynasty. He refused exile. He ordered the destruction of his own country, and he shot himself in a basement at 56 years old. Every other dictator on that list wanted to survive. Hitler wanted the opposite. And that unique inversion is the master key to understanding almost everything people understand wrong about the Third Reich. On January 30th, 1933, at 11:30 in the morning, Adolf Hitler took the oath as Chancellor of the German Reich in the Reich President's Palace in Berlin. They placed the tricolour band on his sleeve. There were handshakes. There were photographs. And what had just occurred in that room was, from the viewpoint of the history of 20th century dictatorships, something completely without precedent. There had been no coup. There had been no civil war. There was no corpse in the streets. The constitutional system of the Weimar Republic itself, the very mechanism designed to contain and channel political power, had just installed in the chancellery the man who had promised to destroy it. Compare that with the rest of the list. Joseph Stalin spent decades maneuvering within the Bolshevik Party, overcoming rivals one by one, taking advantage of the sudden death of Lenin in January 1924 to consolidate a control that no one would have handed him voluntarily. Mao Zedong fought in a civil war that consumed decades and millions of lives before proclaiming the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen on October 1, 1949. Benito Mussolini marched on Rome at the head of his black shirts in October 1922, threatening armed insurrection until King Victor Emmanuel III yielded. Francisco Franco launched a military coup on July 17, 1936 that bled Spain during 3 years of fratricidal war. Fidel Castro spent 2 years in the Sierra Maestra leading a guerrilla insurgency before entering Havana on January 8, 1959. Kim Il-sung was physically installed in Pyongyang by the advance of the Soviet Red Army in 1945. All of them paid the price that the job normally costs: violence, exile, prison, or all three together. Hitler paid none of them. The historian Ian Kershaw, in his monumental biography in 2 volumes published between 1998 and 2000, articulated the mechanism with precision. Hitler was boxed into power by the conservative elites who believed they could keep him on a leash. Former Chancellor Franz von Papen, architect of the deal in the shadows, told a friend a few days before, "We have hired Hitler." Papen's confidence was so absolute that he even bet he could make Hitler retreat in 6 weeks. President Paul von Hindenburg, an 85-year-old field marshal who a few months earlier had dismissively called Hitler the Bohemian corporal, signed the appointment order that same morning. Not because he admired him, but because the political system of the Weimar Republic was so fractured, so paralyzed by the economic crisis unleashed after the stock market crash of October 1929, that Hindenburg had few alternatives that did not involve constitutional rupture, which was exactly what he wanted to avoid. The NSDAP had reached 37.4% of the votes in the elections of July 1932. It had lost 2 million votes in November of that same year, falling to 33.1%. The tide seemed to be receding. Hitler was being defeated by the democratic process, and it was then when the democratic process saved him. Von Papen needed the Nazi votes to form a government. Hindenburg needed stability. Hitler obtained the chancellery with only 2 Nazi ministers in a cabinet of 11 people. The conservatives believed that was enough to control him. In 53 days, that calculation was already irrecoverable. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag met in the Krolloper, the Berlin Opera House, because the Parliament building had burned 3 weeks earlier in a fire that the Nazis attributed to the Communists. The deputies of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, knew exactly what was about to happen. Outside the building, the SA in brown uniforms formed silent lines. Inside, SS soldiers flanked the central aisle. Deputy Otto Welles, president of the SPD, stood up in that atmosphere of calculated intimidation and uttered words that history would record. "You may take our lives and our freedom, but you cannot take our honor." The rest of the Social Democratic deputies who had not already been detained or who had not gone into exile voted against it. All the other parties, including the Catholic Zentrum, voted in favor of the enabling act that handed the executive powers to legislate without the parliament. The final result was 441 to 94. The German parliament itself, by a majority of more than 80%, voluntarily voted for the dissolution of its own authority to make laws. No other dictator of the 20th century had that starting point. None received the keys to the institution designed to stop him from the very hands of that institution. Purges are the signature of dictators. They are the proof that power matters more to them than anything else. They are the mechanism by which a man converts initial victory into permanent dominance. When you observe the Third Reich from the outside, you assume that Hitler operated in the same way, and it is a transition so reasonable, so consistent with everything we know about how autocracies work, that few people stop to check it. The result is surprising. Hermann Göring was at Hitler's side since 1922. He was one of the first leaders of the NSDAP, commander of the SA in the years of struggle, wounded in the groin during the failed Munich Putsch of November 8th to 9th, 1923. During the Weimar Republic, he was elected deputy to the Reichstag in 1928 and became its president in 1932, a position from which he used parliamentary power to torpedo any possibility that the system would block Hitler. In 1933, he was minister-president of Prussia, controlling the largest police force in Germany. In 1936, he directed the four-year plan that reorganized the German economy under war priorities. In July 1940, after the fall of France, Hitler granted him the unique rank of Reichsmarschall, the only title of that rank in the entire German army, an honor that had no precedent nor possible hierarchical ceiling. The man who had been a companion of punches and beer in the years of struggle in Munich was still the number 2 of the regime 18 years later. Joseph Goebbels joined the movement in 1926 and was named Gauleiter of Berlin that same year, with the mission of conquering a city that was a socialist and communist worker fortress. He did it. When Hitler reached power in 1933, Goebbels became Reich Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, controlling the radio, the cinema, the press, and the arts of a country of 70 million people. That position he held without a single interruption or serious threat for 12 years. When Hitler dictated his political testament in the early hours of April 29, 1945, he named Goebbels Chancellor of the Reich, the last of the great positions reserved for the end as a reward to the one who had never relented. The following day, Goebbels ordered the administration of cyanide to his 6 children, aged between 4 and 12 years, and committed suicide alongside his wife Magda in the garden of the Chancellery. Heinrich Himmler joined the party in 1923 and participated also in the Munich Putsch, although in a secondary role carrying the Reichskriegsflagge war flag. In 1929, when Hitler named him Reichsführer SS, the personal protection corps he directed had barely 290 men. What Himmler built with that seed was one of the most extraordinary apparatuses of power that any modern state has ever generated. The SS grew from 290 to more than 1 million members by 1944. They controlled the Gestapo, the counterintelligence, the concentration and extermination camps, the Waffen-SS as a parallel army, the police administration of the occupied territories, and a large part of the productive system that used slave labor from the camps. Himmler was never questioned in that position until the final weeks of the regime, when he tried to negotiate in secret with the Allies through the Swedish mediator Folke Bernadotte and was dismissed by Hitler by telegram on April 28, 1945, when there was already nothing left to dismiss. Martin Bormann was the man who controlled access to Hitler. Head of the party chancellery since 1941 after the flight of Hesse, his power was that of physical proximity. Whoever did not pass through Bormann did not reach the Führer. Albert Speer, the architect and later Minister of Armaments who became one of the closest collaborators of Hitler, described Bormann as the man who exercised the most real power in the Third Reich during the last 3 years of war, not because he had an impressive title, but because he controlled the agenda, the documents and the accesses. He continued in that position until the day Hitler died. Albert Speer, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Alfred Rosenberg, the same faces, the same names, the same men. 12 years later, there were exceptions. But they are so specific and so revealing in their specificity that they confirm the rule instead of contradicting it. Ernst Röhm was the head of the SA, the assault sections, the paramilitary army of brown shirts that had carried Hitler to power based on street violence and systematic terror. In 1934, the SA had more than 3 million men, a force much superior to the regular Reichswehr. Röhm wanted to convert them into the new German army and make Hitler the leader of a social revolution still pending. He was a decorated war veteran, brilliant commander, and one of the very few men with whom Hitler used the informal thou. But he represented an alternative power structure that threatened both the professional army and the conservative elites, whose support Hitler still needed. In the night of the Long Knives, between June 30th and July 2nd, 1934, SS units executed Röhm and the leadership of the SA, as well as some historical political adversaries of the movement. The exact number of dead was never established with certainty. The official Nazi figures said 77. The most solid academic estimates oscillate between 85 and 200 people. It was the most concentrated act of internal political violence that Hitler authorized. And it was unique, it was not repeated. The motivation was not paranoia toward a close collaborator. It was the tactical necessity to neutralize a rival power structure before the army, which Hitler needed to rearm Germany, saw him as an insurmountable obstacle. Röhm was not purged because Hitler suspected his loyalty. He was purged because his organization competed structurally with another organization that Hitler also needed. The logic was that of state consolidation, not that of personal fear. Rudolf Hess, the personal secretary of Hitler, the man who had transcribed Mein Kampf while both were serving their sentence in Landsberg after the putsch of 1923, flew solo to Scotland on May 10, 1941, in a Messerschmitt Bf 110R that had been modified especially for long-distance flight. He landed by parachute near the estate of Dungavel House in Lanarkshire and asked to be led before the Duke of Hamilton, with whom he wanted to negotiate peace, convinced that Great Britain could reach an agreement that would leave Hitler with a free hand in continental Europe. The British interned him and never utilized him for anything. Hitler called him crazy. Himmler was informed and initiated a routine investigation without consequences for anyone in Hess's circle. Rudolf Hess spent the rest of the war as a prisoner of the British, was sentenced in Nuremberg to life imprisonment, and died in Spandau prison on August 17, 1987, at 93 years old. He was not purged. He was declared officially insane and forgotten. Now compare that with Stalin. The Great Terror of 1937 and 1938, the most intense phase of the Soviet purges, left at least 681,692 people executed in less than 2 years, only according to official Soviet figures declassified after the fall of the USSR. The estimates of historians oscillate between 750,000 and 2 million. It eliminated practically all the original Bolsheviks, the men who had made the revolution alongside Lenin, dragging them to the rooms of the military tribunals, forcing them to confess fantastic crimes under torture in the basements of the Lubyanka, and executing them with a shot to the back of the head. Genrikh Yagoda, the head of the NKVD, who had organized the first purges, was himself arrested, tried and executed in 1938. His successor, Nikolai Yezhov, the man who presided over the bloodiest phase of the terror, was removed from office in 1938 when Stalin needed a scapegoat for the excesses. Stalin designated him commissar for water transport, a position of no power, where Yezhov spent weeks going to meetings without saying anything, folding papers in the shape of airplanes and birds and throwing them into the air. In the middle of a commissariat meeting, NKVD agents appeared. Yezhov stood up, threw his pistol on the table and said, "I have been waiting for this a long time." He was executed in 1940. The terror extended to the army. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the most brilliant commander of the Red Army, inventor of the doctrine of deep operations that would influence all military theory of the 20th century, was accused of spying for Germany. He was tried on June 11, 1937, by a tribunal composed of other generals, some of whom would themselves be executed in the following months. They executed him the next day. In total, the military purge eliminated 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Army, 13 of 15 army commanders, 8 of 9 admirals, 50 of 57 corps commanders, and 154 of 186 division commanders. Stalin dismantled his own military command on the eve of the most destructive war in human history because he had more fear of his generals than of Hitler. Hitler never did anything similar, not because he was loyal or kind. The historian Alan Bullock pointed out in his comparative analysis that the difference between the two men was not of intensity, but of orientation. Stalin purged toward the inside of the system because he saw in his own collaborators a threat to his dominance. Hitler always looked toward the outside. The threat in his worldview was never in the inner circle. It was in the racial enemy. And while the racial enemy existed, the team was never the problem. In December 1941, after the first catastrophic weeks of the Soviet counter-offensive that stopped the German advance 30 kilometers from Moscow, Hitler took a decision that has no parallel among the leaders of the Second World War. He relieved Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch from the Supreme Command of the Army and assumed direct control of operations on the Eastern Front himself, not as a representative or symbolic figure, literally and operationally. From that moment, Hitler directed the war at the level of individual divisions. He had maps in every headquarters. In the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, in the forests of East Prussia, with its concrete bunkers several meters thick, its green nylon camouflage nets over the roofs, its independent generators and its forced ventilation systems, the military situation conferences began at noon and could last 4 or 5 hours. Hitler pointed with his chubby finger at marks on the map and dictated the position of specific regiments, sometimes even battalions. His generals watched in silence or, when they dared, argued and were ignored or dismissed. No other leader of the Second World War did that. Winston Churchill trusted Field Marshal Alan Brooke for land strategy. Franklin Roosevelt delegated to General George Marshall. Stalin, who had started the war purging his best commanders, learned the lesson after the catastrophe of Barbarossa and delegated increasingly to Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky for operations on the Eastern Front. Hitler trusted Hitler. And the men who truly knew how to fight a continental war contemplated him with increasing horror. General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of the most brilliant armored commanders of the German army, described the paradox with clinical precision after the war. In his evaluation, Hitler had a detailed knowledge of the lower combat level, the properties of weapons, the effect of terrain and weather, the morale of the troops. He could perfectly understand how a division moved and fought. But how armies operated as a whole, the large strategic and tactical combinations, was something that escaped completely his comprehension. The historian Jeffrey Megargy reached a similar conclusion in his analysis of the German command. What Hitler had achieved, according to Megargy, was winning a battle against his own general staff at the cost of strategy itself, a victory of tactics and ideology over the professional military criteria that could have saved the country. Stalingrad is the concrete image of that abstraction. Starting from November 19, 1942, the Soviet forces of the Southwestern Front under the command of General Nikolai Vatutin and of the Stalingrad Front under the command of General Andrei Yeryomenko initiated Operation Uranus. In 72 hours, the flanks of the German army on the Volga were broken. The Romanian Third and Fourth armies that covered those flanks collapsed. On November 22, 1942, the two Soviet arms joined in Kalach on the Don. The 220,000 men of the German Sixth Army under the command of General Friedrich Paulus were completely encircled. Every superior officer on the Eastern Front understood what had to happen next: break the encirclement, save the men, preserve the army for the next combat. The window to attempt it existed. It was narrow, but it existed. Paulus asked for it. Zeitzler asked for it. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the man they sent to try to break the encirclement from the outside, asked for it. Hitler did not yield an inch. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold the position. He promised an airlift that the basic arithmetic of the transport capacity of the Luftwaffe made impossible. To feed and supply 220,000 men in combat, at least 600 tons daily of supplies were needed. The Luftwaffe, on the best of days with the most favorable weather, could not deliver more than 100. On many days, it delivered nothing. The soldiers of the Sixth Army went from eating reduced rations to eating draft horses to chewing boiled leather to nothing. The temperatures on the Volga in the winter of 1942-1943 dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Men died frozen in their positions. On January 31, 1943, Friedrich Paulus, who hours earlier had been promoted by Hitler to the rank of Field Marshal in a gesture that was also an implicit message that he should die before surrendering, surrendered to General Mikhail Shumilov, commander of the Soviet 64th Army. The following day, the last pockets of resistance to the north of the city did the same. February 2, 1943 was the official date of the complete surrender. 91,000 men walked out into Soviet captivity under a cold that crystallized their breath and blackened their toes. They wore dirty bandages. Many did not have boots. They walked in the snow, leaning on each other. Fewer than 6,000 of them ever returned to Germany. A dictator who does not let his best general save his best army is acting directly against his own interest, which should be impossible, unless the interest is not what everyone assumed. Here is the axis on which the whole story turns. Name the one thing that all other dictators on earth have always shared, the instinct of self-preservation of the regime. Stalin killed to stay alive. Mao purged to preserve power. The Kim dynasty exists because 3 generations have prioritized their own survival above any other consideration. Mussolini escaped disguised towards Switzerland when the Italian partisans approached, and was captured on April 27, 1945 in the town of Dongo, on the shores of Lake Como, trying to cross the Swiss border hidden in a German truck. Ceausescu left Bucharest in a helicopter on December 22, 1989, while the crowd stormed the Central Committee. Saddam Hussein was pulled out of a hole in the ground near Ad-Daur in the province of Saladin on December 13, 2003. Gaddafi was found inside a drainage pipe in Sirte on October 20, 2011. Mobutu, Marcos, Baby Doc Duvalier all fled to foreign exile and lived their last days on the beach of another country. Hitler is the only one among all of them who stayed in Berlin, more than that. The behavior that most clearly separates the Nazi regime from any other dictatorial regime of the 20th century is the decision, documented, systematic, and reiterated, to prioritize extermination above the war even when that prioritization accelerated the defeat. In the spring and summer of 1944, when the situation on the Eastern Front was deteriorating at a rate that made every train car, every locomotive, every railroad track a critical military resource, the Hungarian deportees were arriving at the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex at a rate that its own operators had never seen. Between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, in less than 2 months, approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. The historians Raoul Hilberg and Christopher Browning documented the internal debate between the military authorities and the SS over the use of that railway capacity. The army needed the trains. The SS obtained them for the deportations. Hitler did not interfere to restrict the extermination operations. The gas chambers of Auschwitz II Birkenau worked in those months at maximum capacity. The 4 cremation facilities, built between 1942 and 1943, had technical capacity to incinerate the remains of approximately 4,756 people daily. In the worst days of 1944, when the trains arrived in convoys of 4 or 5 per day, the corpses exceeded that capacity and part of the remains had to be burned in open pits in the open air at the camp. Surviving witnesses such as Primo Levi, who arrived at Auschwitz in February 1944 in a convoy from Italy, described the smell that permeated the air of the camp even before understanding what produced it, a mixture of thick and sweetish smoke that came from the direction of the crematoria. The Sonderkommando, the prisoners forced to work in the crematoria, were eliminated periodically and replaced by new inmates to avoid testimonies. The extermination came first. The war came second. The war was the means for the extermination, not the other way around. The historians who have dedicated their careers to staring fixedly into the interior of the Third Reich converge on that same conclusion from different angles. Ian Kershaw built his interpretation on the concept of working towards the Führer. In the Third Reich, officials and officers at all levels competed to anticipate the desires of the leadership, and the resulting movement was never toward moderation but always toward radicalization. The acts of extermination did not need an explicit direct order in every case. They needed an environment in which the elimination of the racial enemy was the most consistent signal emanating from the center of power. Saul Friedlander, in his monumental work The Third Reich and the Jews, built in part on testimonies of the victims in addition to the perpetrators, argued that Hitler's anti-Semitism was not a tool of political mobilization but the very substance of his vision of the world. The extermination of the Jewish people was not instrumental to any other political objective because it was the political objective in itself. Timothy Snyder, comparing the killing territories between the Soviet space and the Nazi space in his Bloodlands, showed how the Hitlerian violence had an internal logic that no model of conventional political rationality can explain. It did not produce strategic advantages. It did not strengthen the position of the regime against its enemies. It did not consolidate the territory. The only logic that explains it is the logic of the mission. No regime optimized for survival behaves like that. No rational political system diverts military resources toward extermination at the moment of maximum war pressure. The mission always outranked the survival of the regime. There is a detail that Robert G. L. Waite documented in his psychological study of Hitler published in 1977 and that Kershaw confirms from another angle. Hitler thought of the war and of the Jewish question as inseparable entities from the beginning. In his prophecy of January 30th, 1939, pronounced before the Reichstag, he had explicitly declared that if the Jewish financial powers threw Europe into another world war, the result would be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Then, when the war arrived, he used it as retroactive justification and as an operational framework for the extermination. The war was not the cause of the Holocaust. It was the alibi and the environment that made it logistically possible. And when the resources of the war entered into competition with the resources of the extermination won. Everything that comes after in this story is the consequence of that unique inversion. To understand why January 30th, 1933 was possible, one must go back to the man who arrived at that office in the presidential palace. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889 in Braunau am Inn, a small city on the Austrian shore of the River Inn, across from the border with Bavaria. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official, an illegitimate son who had carried for 39 years the surname Schicklgruber before changing it in 1876 to Hitler, the form of the name of Johann Georg Hiedler, who had recognized the paternity of Alois posthumously. Hitler himself confessed in private conversations that Heil Schicklgruber would have sounded impossible as a national greeting. The change of surname of his father was, literally, the first stroke of luck of his life, and it occurred 13 years before he was born. His mother, Clara Pölzl, was, according to all available testimonies, the person whom Hitler genuinely loved throughout his life. The Jewish physician Edward Bloch, who attended Clara Hitler during her agony from a breast cancer that culminated on December 21, 1907, and who later fled Nazi Germany with the explicit protection of Hitler himself, described her as a simple, modest, and kind woman with brown hair and blue-grey eyes of beautiful expression. And he described the pain of the son at her death as something he had never seen in his nearly 40 years of medical practice. The devastation of a young man who had returned from Vienna to sit at the head of her bed and who, in the days following the burial, returned to Bloch's office to thank him personally for his care. Hitler carried a photograph of his mother until the last days in the bunker. The biographer Robert G. L. Waite pointed out in his study that one of the most striking traits of the adult Hitler was his infantilism. The head of state who decided the fate of nations had the tastes, the obsessions, and the lifestyle of the adolescent from Linz. He collected books on phrenology and craniology, the pseudoscience of measuring skulls to deduce character. He consumed industrial quantities of chocolates and sweets in private. He summoned in 1937 a group of medical specialists, headed by the reputable surgeon Ferdinand Sauerbruch. so they could measure with calipers and tapes every centimeter of his skull and compare it with the measurements of Frederick the Great, Bismarck, and Napoleon. He listened with childish satisfaction when they told him that some of his measurements were notably similar to those of Frederick. Yes, write it all down, he told them. His father died when he was 13 years old. His brother Edmund had died when he was 11. The excessive protection of an anxious mother and the threatening presence of a disciplinary and hot-tempered father left a pattern that his biographers have debated for decades. What is documented is the later trajectory: dropping out of school, repeated failure in the entrance exams to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna in 1907 and again in 1908, years of poverty in the shelters for homeless men of the Austro-Hungarian capital, selling watercolors of Viennese themes to tourists and frame merchants. The Academy rejected his works twice. The director of the painting department suggested he orient himself toward architecture, but Hitler did not have the high school diploma required to enter architecture school. The building closed. Young people who fail in their dreams sometimes turn in on themselves. Hitler turned toward the world. It was February 22, 1920, when Hitler spoke before a crowd of more than 2,000 people in the Hofbräukeller in Munich in the first great public act of the NSDAP. The effect was transformative, not only on the public but on himself. Professor Karl Alexander von Müller, historian at the University of Munich, who was present in those first rallies, described what he saw: a clumsy man who, upon starting to speak, became another, filling the room with his voice, dissolving the resistances of the public with an energy that seemed to circulate between the speaker and the audience in a spiral that amplified itself. The German journalist and writer Konrad Haiden, who heard Hitler dozens of times and was one of his earliest critics, described him as a man capable of converting in a matter of minutes a silent and skeptical crowd into a vibrant and united mass. His words go like an arrow toward their destination. They touch every private wound in the raw. They release the collective unconscious, expressing its most intimate aspirations, telling it what it most wants to hear. He had discovered his instrument, the only exceptional capacity he possessed with certainty. The runaway inflation of 1923, the Great Depression started in 1929, the collective trauma of the defeat of 1918, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles with its war guilt clause and its impossible reparations created the ecosystem in which that talent became lethal. Alan Bullock pointed out in his lecture of 1994 that nothing in the early life of Hitler nor in the early life of Stalin suggested the powers they would exhibit later, and that neither of the two would have triumphed without a succession of strokes of luck that they themselves had not created. For Hitler, the decisive stroke of luck was the economic depression. In the elections of 1928, the NSDAP obtained 800,000 votes, 6% of the electorate. A marginal, extremist, violent, disposable party. The Wall Street crash in October 1929 changed the entire equation. By 1930, unemployment in Germany had reached 3 million people. By 1932, it was more than 6 million, 30% of the labor force. In July 1932, the NSDAP obtained more than 13 million votes, 4% of the total. But neither was that enough for power. Hitler lost 2 million votes in November 1932, falling to 1%. The tide seemed to be receding, and it was then, at the moment when the movement was beginning to lose electoral momentum, when the conservative elite intervened. Von Papen needed the Nazi votes to form a stable government. Hindenburg needed to get rid of Schleicher, whose management as Chancellor had failed. Negotiations unfolded in private parlors during the month of January 1933. On January 22nd, von Papen met with Hitler in the house of the banker Kurt von Schröder in Cologne. On January 29th, Hindenburg asked von Papen if he could work toward a solution within the constitutional framework with the backing of the Reichstag. The implicit answer was Hitler. On January 30th, at 11:30 in the morning, Hindenburg signed the appointment order. Goebbels noted in his diary, "Hitler is Reich Chancellor, like a fairy tale." No one in that room understood what had just occurred. The majority believed that Hitler would be contained, domesticated, used. Hugenberg had told a friend that they had hired him as an employee. Von Papen was more explicit. "In 2 months we will have pushed Hitler into a corner where he will squeal." Sebastian Haffner, then a young Berlin lawyer who would later become one of the most lucid analysts of the Nazi phenomenon, recalled that most of the serious press considered the appointment as one more episode of the political instability of Weimar, a government that probably would not survive the winter. In 53 days, that calculation was irrecoverable. The central paradox of Hitlerian violence is that it was immense and at the same time selective in a way that distinguishes it from all other autocrats of the 20th century. The Nazi terror existed. There is no ambiguity about that point. The Gestapo, the secret state police, merged under Heinrich Himmler with the SS in a structure that depended directly on Hitler and operated completely outside any constitutional limitation, was one of the most effective instruments of political repression that the 20th century produced. Concentration camps began to operate days after Hitler reached power. Dachau opened on March 22, 1933, in a former gunpowder factory on the outskirts of that Bavarian city, 12 kilometers from Munich. But that violence was directed systematically toward the outside of the movement, not toward the inside. Stalin killed his own political commissars, his own marshals, the very men who had made the revolution with Lenin. He made internal terror in the highest layers of power his fundamental tool of government. Alan Bullock, who dedicated his academic life to comparing the two men and whose book Hitler and Stalin, Parallel Lives, published in 1991 and revised in 1993, is one of the most rigorous comparative works on both, pointed out that between the two there exists a difference of style that at the same time reveals a difference of nature. Stalin operated in the shadows, Hitler acted in the spotlight. Stalin was the calculator, Hitler the gambler. The Georgian was the experienced administrator, disciplining himself in regular work. The Austrian remained the artist politician, hating routine. Hitler let the most powerful Nazi leaders, Goering, Himmler, Goebbels, Ley, build rival empires and fight among themselves. The Nazi state was not a monolithic bloc remotely. Bullock, following the terminology of Martin Brosat, called it authoritarian anarchy, permanent improvisation, administrative chaos, the exact opposite pole to the exterior image the regime projected. That did not mean Hitler was a weak dictator. On the contrary, the fragmentation of power below Hitler strengthened Hitler's position as the only point of confluence. Each warring fiefdom needed the favor of the Führer to survive. Competition was the mechanism of control. What Hitler never did was purge himself toward the top. The apparatus of repression he built pointed toward the ideologically defined enemies: the Jews, the communists, the social democrats, the political opponents, the racial groups designated as subhuman by Nazi ideology. It did not point toward his own paladins. The same Himmler who built and administered the apparatus of mass extermination, the system of camps that consumed millions of European lives, maintained his position as Reichsführer SS and head of the German police until he betrayed Hitler in the final weeks trying to negotiate peace with the Western Allies. Only then did Hitler dismiss him, when the dismissal was a gesture without consequences. There is an aspect of the Third Reich that few understand correctly, and that is fundamental to comprehending why Hitler was what he was. Governing never interested him. Ian Kershaw articulated it definitively. Hitler hated administration and absented himself from the chancellery for long periods. The Weimar Constitution was never formally replaced. The constitutional rights of the citizen were simply suspended by emergency decree, never formally abolished. The only constitutional foundation of the Nazi regime was the Enabling Act of March 1933. The cabinet met with less and less frequency and did not meet again at all after February 1938. What mattered were the personal decrees of the Führer. The Führer state was not an efficient bureaucratic machinery. It was a system of personal loyalties radiating from a center that reserved for itself the right of absolute intervention at any moment on any matter without consulting anyone. The historian Martin Brosat described the result as a continuous process of cumulative radicalization. In the absence of clear instructions and a rational chain of command, subordinates competed to anticipate the desires of the Führer, pushing policies always toward more extreme positions, because moderation could be interpreted as lukewarmness and lukewarmness as treason. The two most concrete instruments of power Hitler built outside the formal state apparatus were the 4-year plan, directed by Göring, which absorbed an increasing proportion of the German economy and eventually the economies of the occupied countries with the priority of rearmament that Hitler demanded, and the merger of the police and the Gestapo with Himmler's SS, which eliminated the police function of the state and placed it in the hands of an entity unknown to the constitution and responsible solely to Hitler. Hitler built in parallel to the state a personal anti-state, and in that personal anti-state lived what really mattered to him, the racial mission, the program he had announced with all clarity in Mein Kampf, published in 1925 and 1926, for anyone who wanted to read it. The conquest of Lebensraum, living space in the East at the expense of the Slavs, the destruction of Marxism, the elimination of the Jewish enemy, who in his Weltanschauung was the origin of all the evils of the modern world. It was not political rhetoric. It was not calculated electoral demagoguery to capture votes. It was the real program, the only real program, of which everything else was instrumental. Bullock formulated the most disturbing question in his lecture of 1994. If Hitler and Stalin had not existed, would something similar have occurred? His answer was no, not with the same form, not with the same level of radicalism, not with the same human cost. Circumstances created the possibility, men determined what was done with it, and there is no other leader among those available in the NSDAP in 1933, no Göring, no Himmler, no Goebbels, who would have led the country toward where Hitler led it. On March 19, 1945, Adolf Hitler signed a decree that has no equivalent in modern military history. It is known as the Nero Decree, although that designation comes from external observers, not from the official text, which bore the dry and bureaucratic heading of destructive measures on Reich territory. The decree was an order for the systematic demolition of all German infrastructure before the Allies could utilize it. Bridges, factories, power plants, railroads, food warehouses, water supplies. Behind the week in which he signed it, there is a conversation that Albert Speer, the Reich Armaments Minister, left recorded in his notes taken 10 days later. Hitler had told him in the Chancellery office among the rubble of the bombings that if the war was lost, the nation also deserved to perish. Because it had proven itself to be the weaker one. Only those who were inferior deserved to survive. The German people, in other words, were going to be punished for not having lived up to the task. Speer, the cold technocrat who had built the armaments apparatus that kept the German war running longer than any rational analysis would have predicted, was left speechless. He had been trying for weeks to convince Hitler not to destroy the infrastructure that Germany would need to rebuild itself. His memorandum to the Führer argued that they did not have the right, at that stage of the war, to destroy what the German people would need to exist in the future. Hitler's response was the Nero Decree, a declaration of war against his own citizens. Speer's response was to sabotage the decree in silence, working with industrialists and generals to obstruct its application during the remaining weeks. The decree did not come to be applied on its full scale because the collapse of the front occurred faster than the administrative apparatus could execute the orders. But the fact that it existed, the fact that Hitler signed it and explained it with that logic of survival of the fittest that turned against the very people he supposedly led, is one of the most revealing documents of the real character of the Third Reich. Every other dictator who loses flees. Hitler, to the country he was losing, destroys it. The historian Christian Goeschel, in his book Suicide in Nazi Germany, published by Oxford University Press in 2009, documented something that has no precedent in modern history, a wave of suicides within the regime's own circles that in Goeschel's analysis has no equivalent in any comparable historical record. The numbers are precise and they are terrifying. Among the party leaders, Joseph Goebbels committed suicide on May 1st, 1945, alongside his wife Magda, after ordering the administration of cyanide to his 6 children in the bunker: Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig and Heidrun, aged between 4 and 12 years. Heinrich Himmler committed suicide on May 23, 1945, by biting a cyanide capsule upon being identified by the British. Hermann Göring committed suicide on October 15, 1946, hours before his scheduled execution, also with cyanide. Martin Bormann died probably on May 2, 1945, trying to escape from Berlin, although his exact fate was debated for decades. Among the military, 53 of the 554 generals of the German army committed suicide in 1945. 14 of the 98 generals of the Luftwaffe, 11 of the 53 admirals of the Kriegsmarine. In Berlin alone, more than 7,000 suicides were recorded throughout 1945, according to municipal archives. The real figure was probably higher. Many deaths in that period were not recorded at all. There is no other political regime of the 20th century in which the leaders and officers themselves took their own lives in those proportions after defeat. The leaders of Italian fascism, of the Vichy regime, of the collaborationist governments of Eastern Europe fled, surrendered, or were captured. Those of the Third Reich killed themselves at an unprecedented rate. The Walther PPK caliber .635 pistol with which Hitler shot himself in the right temple on April 30, 1945 in the Führer bunker, 5 meters underground in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, while Soviet shells bored into the ground meters away, was not the exception to that wave, it was its apex. In January 1942, in a 20-room villa on the shore of Lake Wannsee, in the southwestern outskirts of Berlin, 15 high-ranking Nazi and SS officials met for approximately 90 minutes under the chairmanship of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office. The objective of the conference was to coordinate the implementation of what the documents called the final solution of the Jewish question. The Wannsee Protocol, the minutes of that meeting drafted by Adolf Eichmann, estimated at 11 million the Jewish population of Europe on which the program should be applied. That number included the Jews of countries not yet occupied. Great Britain 330,000, Ireland 4,000, Switzerland 18,000, Spain 6,000. The horizon of the plan was not occupied Europe, it was Europe in its entirety. Systematic extermination by means of gas chambers had begun before that meeting. The Chelmno Extermination Center in occupied Poland began its operations on December 8, 1941. Belzec began on March 17, 1942. Sobibor on May 16, 1942. Treblinka on July 22, 1942. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the extermination centers, developed its industrial capacity to kill throughout 1942 and 1943 until its 4 crematoria could incinerate up to 4,756 bodies daily. Treblinka was not a labor camp. There was no medical selection on the platform, no division between those who could work and those who could not. The trains arrived. The doors opened. The deportees were led toward the gas chambers in about 20 minutes. The entire camp had an area of approximately 600 by 400 meters. It was designed exclusively for killing. In 16 months of operation, between July 1942 and August 1943, around 900,000 people died in its gas chambers, according to the estimates of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Bullock pointed out, in his analysis of the authorship of the final solution, that there was only one man among the Nazi leaders capable of conceiving something so grandiose and so monstrous. Not Himmler, not Goering, but Hitler. And that if there was a year in which Hitler was capable of taking the leap from imagining that solution as fantasy to imagining it as reality, that year was 1941. The same year in which he had converted into literal fact another fantasy, that of Lebensraum, the empire in the East, by means of the invasion of Russia. Hitler delegated the operational organization to Himmler and Heydrich and the SS. But in Bullock's evaluation, without a Hitler who conceived those projects and convinced others that they could become reality, neither of the two would have occurred. For the summer of 1944, while the German army collapsed in Normandy and the collapse of Army Group Center in Operation Bagration eliminated in 6 weeks more than 500,000 German soldiers from the Eastern Front, the trains carrying Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau arrived at a rate of 4 or 5 convoys daily. The military requested that railway capacity. The SS obtained it. Hitler did not interfere. At the moment of maximum war pressure, extermination was the priority. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, 2 million German soldiers crossed the borders of the Soviet Union on the most extensive front in the history of war. Operation Barbarossa deployed 153 German divisions plus 37 from Allies. The front extended 2,900 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The decision to launch that attack was personal and irrevocable from Hitler. Taken on July 31st, 1940, barely 6 weeks after the fall of France, while the Germans still celebrated the fastest and most complete victory that any European army had obtained since Napoleon. Hitler ordered the High Command of the army to begin planning for a 5-month campaign that would destroy the Soviet state. He ordered it without consulting anyone. He ordered it knowing that Great Britain remained at war. He ordered it convinced with the absolute certainty that the victory over France had installed permanently in him that his strategic criterion was infallible. Bullock pointed out that only leaders completely sure of their position and free to act without consultation could risk such radical political investments. Hitler could sign the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact with the Soviet Union in August 1939 and then launch a war of extermination against it less than 2 years later because the regime was he and he did not need to render accounts to anyone. Barbarossa captured 4 million Soviet prisoners before 1941 ended. Nearly 3 million of them died in German captivity. The temperatures that winter fell to levels that the German planners had systematically ignored in their calculations. German soldiers fought in summer boots when the thermometer marked 40 degrees below zero. The artillery pieces refused to work. The tank engines froze during the night and could not start in the morning. And it was at that moment, in December 1941, when Hitler committed what the historian Alan Bullock himself identified as the most incomprehensible strategic error of the war, declaring war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor on December 11, 1941. He was not obligated to do it. The tripartite pact with Japan and Italy did not automatically obligate him to support Japan in an offensive war that Japan had initiated. He did it voluntarily. He doubled the bet at the worst possible moment. The political scientist John Mearsheimer and other international policy analysts have pointed out that that decision converted what could have been a limited European war into a truly global conflict that Germany had no real possibility of winning. Hitler did it anyway, because the logic that governed his decisions was not the logic of the survival of the regime, it was the logic of the mission. And for the mission, the war was not the objective, it was the means. In January 1942, in a 20-room villa on the shore of Lake Wannsee, in the southwestern outskirts of Berlin, 15 high-ranking Nazi and SS officials met for approximately 90 minutes under the chairmanship of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office. The objective of the conference was to coordinate the implementation of what the documents called the final solution of the Jewish question. The Wannsee Protocol, the minutes of that meeting drafted by Adolf Eichmann, estimated at 11 million the Jewish population of Europe on which the program should be applied. That number included the Jews of countries not yet occupied. Great Britain 330,000, Ireland 4,000, Switzerland 18,000, Spain 6,000. The horizon of the plan was not occupied Europe, it was Europe in its entirety. Systematic extermination by means of gas chambers had begun before that meeting. The Chelmno Extermination Center in occupied Poland began its operations on December 8, 1941. Belzec began on March 17, 1942. Sobibor on May 16, 1942. Treblinka on July 22, 1942. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the extermination centers, developed its industrial capacity to kill throughout 1942 and 1943 until its 4 crematoria could incinerate up to 4,756 bodies daily. Treblinka was not a labor camp. There was no medical selection on the platform, no division between those who could work and those who could not. The trains arrived. The doors opened. The deportees were led toward the gas chambers in about 20 minutes. The entire camp had an area of approximately 600 by 400 meters. It was designed exclusively for killing. In 16 months of operation, between July 1942 and August 1943, around 900,000 people died in its gas chambers, according to the estimates of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Bullock pointed out, in his analysis of the authorship of The Final Solution, that there was only one man among the Nazi leaders capable of conceiving something so grandiose and so monstrous. Not Himmler, not Goering, but Hitler. And that if there was a year in which Hitler was capable of taking the leap from imagining that solution as fantasy to imagining it as reality, that year was 1941. The same year in which he had converted into literal fact another fantasy, that of Lebensraum, the empire in the East, by means of the invasion of Russia. Hitler delegated the operational organization to Himmler and Heydrich and the SS. But in Bullock's evaluation, without a Hitler who conceived those projects and convinced others that they could become reality, neither of the two would have occurred. For the summer of 1944, while the German army collapsed in Normandy and the collapse of Army Group Center in Operation Bagration eliminated in 6 weeks more than 500,000 German soldiers from the Eastern Front, the trains carrying Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau arrived at a rate of 4 or 5 convoys daily. The military requested that railway capacity. The SS obtained it. Hitler did not interfere. At the moment of maximum war pressure, extermination was the priority. A dictator who does not plan for his life after himself has decided in some profound sense that there should be no life after him. Hitler had no children. He had no grandchildren. There was no ruling family waiting in the wings, no nephew being prepared, no heir being modelled in secret. When Hindenburg died on August 2, 1934, Hitler did not restore the presidency of the Republic with some candidate of his confidence. He merged the titles of Chancellor and President into the single position of Führer and Reich Chancellor, creating a position that was he and nothing more than he. The contrast with regimes designed to last is absolute. The Kim family has already been in power for 4 generations in North Korea. Kim Il-sung built the state. Kim Jong-il inherited the state from his father. Kim Jong-un inherited the state from his father. The Assads ruled Syria for more than 50 years between father and son. The Duvaliers ruled Haiti for nearly 3 decades. The Somozas controlled Nicaragua for more than 40 years. The Castros ruled Cuba for more than 60. Stalin, who killed anyone who could succeed him, so that no one could, left anyway a system that survived 38 years after his death. The USSR dissolved in 1991. Stalinism did not die with Stalin. Hitler's state dissolved in 8 days. Admiral Karl Dönitz, named successor in Hitler's political testament, dictated on April 29, 1945, signed the unconditional military capitulation on May 7, 1945, with effect starting from midnight on May 8. 8 days after the death of Hitler, the Third Reich had ceased to exist as a political entity. The Flensburg government, the ghost government that Dönitz presided over during those days from the Naval Academy on the Baltic Sea, was dissolved by the Allied powers on May 23, 1945. Nothing had been built to survive him because, at some level that historians continue trying to articulate with precision, the state was never the point, it was the vehicle. And when the vehicle could no longer carry anywhere the mission for which it was built, its destruction was the logical consequence. The Führer bunker was a complex of 18 rooms built 5 meters under the garden of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The reinforced concrete walls were 4 meters thick. The roof was 3.5 meters thick. It was resistant enough to withstand the shells from the Soviet field guns that fell upon the city, not enough to change the result of the war. Hitler arrived permanently at the bunker on January 16, 1945, when the collapse of the Eastern Front made staying in the Chancellery above ground level unsustainable. He spent his last 105 days there. The air was constant and mechanical. The generators that powered the ventilation roared in the background 24 hours a day. The humidity was high. The corridors had a smell of wet concrete, sweat and cigarettes, because in the bunker people smoked, although Hitler hated it. The military conferences at noon, which before had involved dozens of generals with maps of Europe on enormous tables, had been reduced to 4 or 5 people leaning over maps that showed positions increasingly compressed. On April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, the atmosphere was more funeral than festive. That day he went up to the Chancellery Garden to review a group of army delegations from Courland, SS units in Berlin, and 20 boys from the Hitler Youth who had been decorated in combat. The testimonies of those who were present describe a physically destroyed man, the left hand trembling uncontrollably, the back hunched, the eyes watery and unfocused, dragging his feet to walk, unable to maintain facial composure. One of the secretaries who observed him from a window thought that if those Hitler Youth boys saw closely the person they had sworn to follow until death, something in the world would break. On April 22nd came the confirmation that the Red Army had penetrated the northern suburbs of Berlin. The attack of General Felix Steiner, in which Hitler had placed his last hopes of breaking the encirclement, had not occurred. Steiner's units simply had not attacked because they had no men or means to do it. For half an hour, in the conference room of the bunker with only 4 witnesses, Hitler unleashed what General Wilhelm Burgdorf, military adjutant, described as the most brutal explosion he had witnessed in his entire career. Afterward, Hitler's tone collapsed into a whisper. The war was lost. He said it out loud for the first time. His witnesses remained in silence. He remained in Berlin. That same night, when the first of his paladins began to say goodbye to escape toward the north and the south, when Goering sent his telegram proposing to take command of the government, when Himmler was secretly trying to negotiate through Swedish mediators with General Eisenhower, Hitler dismissed them and ordered their detention with gestures that no longer had any real content. On April 29th, at 1 a.m, he dictated his political testament. He named Dönitz President of the Reich and Goebbels Chancellor in that order. He named Schörner in command of the army. The private testament disposed of his personal possessions. In that testament, he recognized his marriage to Eva Braun, celebrated hours earlier with a civil official in the office of the bunker itself, with the din of Soviet shells as background. The following day, April 30th, 1945, around 3:30 in the afternoon in the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler died from a shot to the right temple with his Walter PPK pistol. Eva Braun died alongside him by ingestion of cyanide. Their bodies were carried up the emergency stairs to the Chancellery garden and burned with the gasoline they had prepared under the Soviet artillery fire that did not cease. The Soviet commander Georgy Zhukov did not manage to take the bunker until May 2nd. The remains of Hitler and Eva Braun were not identified with forensic certainty for decades. In his analysis of the death of Hitler, Ian Kershaw wrote that he died defeated but without regret, convinced still of his mission, lamenting only not having had time to complete it. The last sentence of his political testament was an instruction to the Germans to keep the racial laws alive and to resist the universal poisoner of all nations, in the same terminology he had used in his first speeches in Munich in 1919. Join now all the elements. A man to whom they handed power legally instead of taking it by force. A man who maintained the same inner circle for 12 years without purging anyone of importance, in marked contrast with almost all comparable autocrats of his era. A man who personally conducted the most destructive war in history at the level of individual divisions, leaving the overall strategy in the hands of his own defects. A man who did not build any dynasty, who did not prepare any successor until the final hours of his life, and who at the end issued an order for the destruction of his own country as a deliberate political act. A man who died in a basement, surrounded by personnel who died around him, while his propaganda apparatus projected the image of a Führer who had fallen fighting in defense of Berlin, and a public image, that of the ascetic monk king, which was in almost all its details a construction of propaganda. A man who in 1945 was probably the richest man in Europe, who maintained a life companion for 16 years in a state secret, who accumulated a fortune from sources that included the royalties of a book that the state obligatorily delivered to every newlywed couple in Germany. The only truly coherent thing, the only thing that traces a straight line from the Munich office in 1919 to the bunker in 1945, is the racial apocalyptic mission. Everything else, power, the state, the war, the image, the fortune, was instrumental regarding that mission. And when the instruments failed, the response was to destroy them. Normal dictators are selfish, and that selfishness, however twisted and brutal it may be, has a consequence that is sometimes overlooked. Countries survive them. The Soviet apparatus survived Stalin. Cuba survived Castro. North Korea survives each Kim. Even the Italian fascist regime survived Mussolini as a political entity until Mussolini himself was executed. Hitler's regime did not survive Hitler because it was never designed to survive Hitler. It was the manifestation of a will, not an institution. And when the will was exhausted, the manifestation disappeared with it, taking between 60 and 85 million people. That is the real answer to the question that gives this video its name. Hitler is the opposite of all other dictators because all other dictators at some level wanted to live. And because he wanted exactly the opposite, because he built a regime oriented toward a mission instead of towards survival, the cost was what it was. If what makes Hitler unique as a dictator is also what made him uniquely catastrophic, does that mean that all other dictators were, in their horrible way, the safer type? Leave your answer in the comments.